You gotta see this before it's too late. Climate change has been at the forefront of public discourse for a few years now, with the radical left being able to take over the narrative and implement their ideologically driven policies. But as these policies have gotten more radical, we've seen pushback against them, from the farmers and truckers protests to an increasing number of people that are coming forward and criticizing the massive government spending and the notion of lowering our standards of living. One of these people is none other than Konstantin Kisin, who recently was interviewed by John Anderson. Needless to say, they both put forward great arguments regarding this issue, but before I delve deeper into it, just watch the clip.
I'll give you an example. A very, very senior journalist in this country said to me the other day, he's trying to put together a piece on the utter dishonesty we're getting from our leadership at the moment about climate change. The dishonesty he's talking about is not to argue with the science. It's something else I've been saying for a long time, because this issue of trust. We've got a huge debate going on in Australia at the moment about the cost of living. And governments are pretending they can solve it with all the solutions that are going to make it worse, by the way. But here's the great lie. Of course, if you're worried about emissions, you're saying human beings are overdoing it and we need to reduce your living standards. And so you're saying to young people who are worried about climate change, we'll get you a secure future, without being honest and saying, actually, we've got to lower your living standards. There is no other way around this. This talk about a new economy built on renewables being prosperity for everybody. Nobody really believes that. There's no leadership. Leadership would demand that you actually level with people and say, we've got to make these massive changes, if that's what you believe, and they will result in lower living standards. It is not true that renewables are cheaper in this country, for example, than coal. They're not, and they never will be. And no one even points out, for example, these massive solar farms we're building. You've got to go and replace them all within 20 years. Replace them all. So there's this incredible walking of both sides of the street. I guess my question to you is, do you think people sort of instinctively understand that they're being misled?
Some people do, and some people don't. And if you remember my speech at the Oxford Union, which did crazy numbers online, in which this is the great tragedy of my career. I keep getting recognition and opportunities because I'm saying really obvious things that everybody knows. I'm just one of the few people prepared to say them. All I said in that speech, all I said in terms of the climate issue was, poor people do not want to stay poor. That means they're going to keep growing their economies. And that means that the way to solve climate change is going to be through technology and getting better at resource efficiency, etc. You are not going to get people to reduce their living standards. You are just not. And everybody, broadly speaking, knows it when they hear it, but you don't hear it said because it's unsayable in the public space.
Konstantin is correct here. People are afraid to speak out against drastic environmental policies because of the heightened polarization regarding this issue. This is made worse by the radical left, which most of the time employs cancel culture tactics. This kind of vilification is deterring public figures, politicians, and even regular individuals from expressing any dissenting views due to fear of woke backlash or professional repercussion. When individuals are afraid to voice their concerns or alternative ideas, it only leads to the implementation of policies that are not fully vetted or that fail to achieve the desired outcomes due to lack of real engagement or critique. And we're seeing that unfold in real time. By the way, do subscribe for more discussions just like this. Governments in the West are forcing people into this transition and burdening the taxpayers and working class with the huge initial cost of transitioning to renewable energy. For lower income households, these increased costs significantly impact their cost of living, making it harder to afford basic necessities. This is not to mention that building the infrastructure for renewable energy sources requires significant upfront investment. This was never the case with fossil fuels, where the wealth generated from its extraction has led to significant economic multiplier effects in national economies, improving living standards globally. Additionally, many people fail to acknowledge that the production of renewable energy technologies requires rare earth metals and other materials that may come from politically unstable regions. The extraction of these materials have significant environmental and human rights violations. The life cycle environmental impact of manufacturing, installing, maintaining, and eventually disposing of renewable energy systems is also not to be neglected. While these impacts are different from those associated with fossil fuels, they're not negligible and need to be carefully managed to ensure that the transition to renewable does not replicate or create new issues that we have to deal with later on in the future. And there's also the issue of reliability of renewable energy. The irregularity of solar and wind farms simply doesn't fill our energy needs. Some early adapters of renewable energy like California and Germany are seeing the problem already. It comes in the form of grid instability and blackouts. As a result, California is cutting new solar way back, keeping gas plants running, and postponing the planned shutdown of the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant.
When I watched that, I immediately thought Indonesia, fourth most populous nation on earth, rising out of poverty in many ways. In many ways, an admirable people doing amazing things, great challenges. But my understanding is there's somewhere between 100 and 150 million people in that country still spending 90% of their income on food. So given that cheap energy is critical to the cost of food, the slightest interruption and suddenly you're pushing people back into a situation where they can't feed their kids. They don't care about the environment when that happens. They care about feeding their kids.
I had lunch with the Indian ambassador to the UK a few months ago, actually after I gave that speech. And I asked him, what do you think about what I've said? And he said, when India became independent in 1947, average life expectancy, I think, was 32. 1947, John, within the lifetime of many people who are alive today. Today, it's over 70. How did that happen? It happened because they're burning fossil fuels and they're using energy to make the lives of their people better, to make sure that their infants survive longer, and they've massively cut infant mortality. You think they want to go back to 1947? Don't be silly. This is nonsense. So the idea that we're going to prevent billions of people, which is who is causing most of this emissions now, to reduce their standards of living, to watch their children die in agony from preventable disease or lack of medical care or whatever, it's not going to happen. So we should stop pretending. But again, this is a question of leadership. And I think we've got ourselves locked into a vicious cycle. The media wants to present politicians as liars. Therefore, you get politicians who are liars. We then have contempt for them. No one then wants to go into politics who's honest. And it just goes round and round and round. And somebody is going to have to come along and break that cycle.
Well, sooner the better. It really is. And they're going to have to be people who clearly understand that the Western experiment has produced the best results for people, even if you talk about that doubling of lifespan in the developing world, because it's essentially happened under the stewardship of the West and the Americans leading it, whether we like it or not, a reasonably stable global order since the end of the Second World War, especially given that the Cold War didn't develop into a hot one. It's been about scientific research, and not many Australians know this, but the role we played in the Green Revolution, doubling those lifespans in the impoverished part of the world. It's the one area where Australia is punched way above its weight. Even today, we're amongst the 7 biggest investors in agricultural research for the benefit of the less well-off, 6 countries and the Gates Foundation. But it's also been affordable, available energy. All of those factors, they're all at risk. And nobody's talking about the trade-offs.
While the need for sustainable development is universally acknowledged, the ability to implement such policies without compromising economic growth and poverty alleviation efforts vary significantly across countries. Many countries in the global south are still in developmental stages where economic growth is the primary objective. This growth is heavily reliant on industrialization processes that require significant energy inputs, which is supplied by fossil fuels due to their cost effectiveness and abundance. In contrast, renewable energy technologies require massive initial investments for infrastructure, such as wind turbines, solar panels, and grid modernization. These investments are challenging for nations grappling with budget constraints and other immediate public needs, like healthcare, education, and basic infrastructure. The woke left has to realize that a substantial portion of the population in developing countries still lacks access to basic necessities, like reliable electricity for one. Fossil fuels, due to their energy density and established supply chains, play a critical role in rapidly expanding energy access, which is a precondition for improving living standards and reducing poverty. For instance, the United Nations Trade and Development Report notes that in 2019, and I quote, more than half of the people living in the least developed countries, LDC, lacked access to electricity, adding rural electrification is particularly low, with 2/3 of the rural LDC population, 458 million people, completely without access to electricity, and even in urban centers, up to 1/3 of the population in LDCs doesn't have access to electricity, and where electricity is available, access is often unreliable. I think it's absurd that the left hasn't yet gotten the message. Daily MSM propaganda is telling us the renewables are the solution and thus distracting us from the harsh reality that we're headed into. The United States and EU are incurring many hundreds of billions of dollars of public debt for clean energy, and there's great pressure to use most of that money almost exclusively to build solar and wind farms that, by themselves, won't allow us to close fossil fuel plants. This relentless push towards renewables without adequately addressing the infrastructural and economic challenges reveals a disconnect between ideological aspirations and practical reality. Ignoring the critical role of fossil fuels in immediate poverty reduction and economic development, or the complexity of transitioning to renewables, will lead to policy missteps that compromise both economic stability and environmental stability. I think the debate must be grounded in a realistic assessment of global energy needs as well as a balanced approach to energy transition, and perhaps the nuclear option should be added to the mix as well.